All right, good afternoon, good morning, everyone joining us in the UK. Good afternoon, those joining us here in China, and good very early morning to anyone joining from the US or elsewhere. Welcome to the 13th in the series of Romantic Horizons talks from Humanities and Social Sciences here at XJTLU. We're delighted today to welcome as our speaker, Dr. Yimon Lo, who is postdoctoral fellow at the University of Tübingen and research fellow at KU Leuven. Yimon is the author of the book she's going to be speaking to us about today, Musical Wordsworth, Romantic Soundscape and Harmony, published by Liverpool University Press in 2023. Her work appears in journals including Romanticism, English Journal of the English Association, the Coleridge Bulletin, and the Tennyson Research Bulletin. Yimon completed her PhD at Durham University. She held postdoctoral fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at University of Edinburgh. She's currently editing a collection of essays on romantic synchronicity, literary coincidence, and the poetics of simultaneity. She's membership secretary of the British Association for Romantic Studies and a member of the prize committee for the 2023 Bar's First Book Prize. So on behalf of everyone here at XJTLU, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Yimon, and let's listen to her talk. I'll hand over to her now. Thanks very much, Yimon. Thank you for coming to talk.
Thank you, Tom, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this seminar series. So first of all, I would just like to apologize for my unstable internet. So if anyone can hear me or can't see the screen at any point of my lecture, please be patient. And yeah, and also thanks to Nelly for designing the lovely poster for the event. And right, so
actually, sorry,
can everyone see this? Yeah.
Sorry, but just to remind everyone, our format is we have a 1-hour lecture from Yimon, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. If you'd like to queue up a question for Yimon, then please type it in the chat, and I'll put you in the queue. Otherwise, please just raise your hand or use the raise hand button on the screen to ask a question. All right, thank you. Thanks, Yimon.
Right, so this talk derives from my new book, Musical Wordsworth, Romantic Soundscape and Harmony. And in this book, I conceptualize Wordsworth's idea of harmony by engaging with scholarship from the fields of music, psychology, and aesthetics. I define Wordsworth's poetry and the imagination through musical conceptions, and establish various modes and forms of poetic listening as experiences of musical performance and appreciation. So Tom has asked whether it's possible for me to say a bit about my own methods as scholar and researcher, and perhaps also some of the ways to frame a research project. So before I get into the details of today's lecture, I would like to share with you and how I came across this topic for my book, the challenges of adopting such a methodology, and the rationale behind this approach. So first, a bit about myself. I grew up with fond memories of playing instruments and going to classical concerts. So I've always been fascinated by the close connection between poetry and music. Among the many Romantic poets, I was particularly drawn to the works of William Wordsworth, but not because he was known for his musical abilities. Quite the contrary, he was criticized by some of his contemporaries as unmusical. So for example, Edward Quillian once commented that Wordsworth was a poet who had no ear for instrumental music. But despite these remarks, I thought that Wordsworth's poetry contained many impressive musical references and auditory imagery, as well as complex thematic and stylistic engagements with the music of verse. So this made me wonder, how can we define the sense of musicality in Wordsworth's poetry? What is the function of his musical ideas in theory and practice? And how did Wordsworth transfer his understanding of formal and metrical musicality to his representations of the imaginative effects of auditory perception? I've encountered numerous challenges to my methodology when applying music theories to my study of Wordsworth's poetry. For instance, some literary and humanities scholars, they are not romanticists, but still, though, anyway, they questioned the possibility of whether my work should belong to the field of musicology rather than literary studies. I think this confusion shows either their unfamiliarity with the ideas of imagery and the imagination that are fundamental to our appreciation of romantic poetry, or indeed poetry in general, or the general disregard for the rigorous skills and professional expertise involved in music analysis. So to address in more detail the objective and difficulty of using music theories in my research, I would like to stress that my study does not in any way suggest that Wordsworth was personally informed or directly influenced by musical studies. It instead draws on applicable concepts from music, psychology, aesthetics, practice, or perception as a critical lens for interpreting the abstract function and mechanism of Wordsworth's musicality. These theories provide a necessary framework and relevant vocabulary for understanding Wordsworth's metrical art. His writings about the processes of listening, representations and descriptions of soundscapes, the idea of rhythm, such that a continuum of auditory experience can be established between the poet speaker, the characters, and readers in Wordsworth's lyric poems. While conceptually there are differences between the use of sound imagery and auditory perception, there are practical difficulties in separating the two notions on the level of textual engagement. So with this in mind, I would now move on to my lecture on Wordsworth's Song of Harmony. I will start by introducing a general overview of the literary concept of harmony during the Romantic period, before going into the idea of harmony that is inherent in Wordsworth's theory of the imagination, and concluding with my own definition of Wordsworthian harmony. In his essay of 1815, Wordsworth indicates that all higher poetry should be modeled on a pure and refined scheme of harmony. Coleridge, in a similar fashion, locates a manly harmony in the satires of John Donne, and comments that the unity of philosophy and poetry in the works of Milton and Shakespeare evokes a sense of delightful harmony. To justify Plato's status as a poet, Shelley praises his endeavor to kindle a harmony in thoughts. For many Romantic writers, harmony was the defining characteristic of good poetry. The Romantic period witnessed a notable rise in literary writings that borrowed the notion of harmony in music to describe the auditory or acoustic achievement of prosody. Shelley, for instance, remarks that the distinction between poetry and other genres lies in the use of meter or a certain system of traditional forms of harmony and language, which is produced by a harmonious recurrence of sound reminiscent of music. Music, harmony, and language are intricately intertwined in the discussions of meter. Associating poetic syllables with musical notes and accents with tones, William Mitford's inquiry into the principles of harmony in language in 1804 stresses the importance of harmony in poetic composition, where harmony is the happy combination of melody and measure, a pleasurable arrangement of rhythm and other oral elements in poetry. Wordsworth experienced a similar joy that Mitford notes, a complex feeling of delight in the music of harmonious metrical language. The complexity of Wordsworth's delight, however, suggests a more profound and philosophical understanding of harmony, and indicates that the scheme of harmony extends beyond the sounding of words and metrical rhythm. The concept of harmony, according to Paul Fussell's survey of 8th century prosodic theory, not only plays an integral role in the language of metrical appreciation, but inclines to denote the consonance between the sound of the words and their sense in the Romantic period. In his 1816 letter to Robert Pierce Gillies, Wordsworth explicates his placement of pauses and displacement of stressed patterns in blank verse by relating to the effect of harmony. These pauses should never be introduced for convenience, and not often for the sake of variety merely, but for some special effect of harmony or emphasis. Asserting the departure from traditional metrical patterning as a requirement for poetic harmony or emphasis, Wordsworth perceives harmony not as a product of convenience or structural diversity, but as an effective force associated with the sensing of verse. Formal harmony contours the movement and organization of plot and argument, and aids the flow and development of ideas and subjects. M.H. Abrams identifies a close affinity between literary effect and musical structure with respect to the concept of harmony in Romantic literature. Literature was made to emulate music by substituting a symphonic form, a melody of ideas and images, a thematic organization, a harmony of moods for the structural principles of plot, argument, or exposition. More specifically, the harmony of moods in poetry for Joseph Thielen is attained through a strongly marked central structure that sets up a clear and definable movement, which can be manipulated to mimic the movement of the action of the poem, or the doubts, hesitations, and emphases of the speaking voice. In Wordsworth's thoughts on poetic turns and modification, harmony was a guiding principle. He looked to the dignified simplicity and majestic harmony of Milton's sonnets as a model of intense unity for his private reflection and public preoccupations. Harmony for Wordsworth is an organized but dynamic sense of musicality that is fundamentally connected to the mediating and modifying powers of the imagination. He carefully crafted his musical language and metaphors as a tool for illuminating the harmonizing mechanism involved in the process of poetry making, as well as expressing his views on the universe and humanity. Wordsworth's imagination engages with the unifying but accommodating qualities that musical harmony achieves. The resemblance between the organizational principle of Wordsworth's imagination and the harmonizing power of music forms a rhetoric of harmonic conceit that Jason Knott terms in his reading of the Prelude. This concept of harmonic conceit considers music as a specifically constructed mediative nature and the mind. It calls for a more comprehensive appreciation of Wordsworth's complex understanding of harmony in relation to the balancing act of the mind between inner and outer sources of creativity. Musical metaphors and figurations not only contour the development of a romantic sense of self-consciousness, in Wordsworth's imagination, but are also self-consciously adopted by his poetry to reflect its own creative process, as well as its own status as a product of the imagination. At the outset of his autobiographical poem, Wordsworth explicates his ambition in musical terms by establishing his poetic aspiration as well as the product of his imaginative strength as some philosophic song that is thoughtfully fitted to the accompaniment of the Orphean lyre. Alluding to Milton's image of the Orphean lyre in Book 3 of Paradise Lost, Wordsworth shapes his poetic endeavor as an epic journey or a unity of experiences to be undergone by the mind. The Orphic voice upholds the overall harmony of the poet's task by promoting truth and meditative passion in his musical verse. Coleridge's tribute to William Wordsworth characterizes the 1805 prelude as an Orphic song indeed, a song divine of high and passionate thoughts to their own music chanted. The self-sufficient and expressive chanting of the verse resonates with the enchanting song of Orpheus, which makes audible a linked lay of truth profound, sweet, continuously, not learned, but native, her own natural notes. For Coleridge, there is a high seriousness as well as passionate enthusiasm in the musical incantation of Wordsworth's glad preamble, which connects powerfully to the Orphic tradition in musical practice. Wordsworth's purpose of associating his poetry with the Orphic sheds light on his theory of a unifying imagination that resembles the harmonizing power of music. Other appearances of Orpheus can be observed in two of the poems categorized under poems of the imagination, Power of Music and The Power of Sound. Praising the entrancing power of music through Orpheus, the Grecian mythological figure of a poet-musician, Wordsworth shapes the function of the imagination by associating it with the ordering and reordering power of music and sound. An extended theme of poetry as song that recurs on many occasions in Wordsworth's poems, as a means to forge a connection between the imagination and musical harmony. To quote a few examples, Wordsworth refers to his first extant poem as my toilsome song. He celebrates the mind of man, my haunt and the main region of my song in the recluse. Wordsworth's aspiration to establish his poetry as music is highlighted in his own revisions of the prelude. Collating the 1805 and 1850 editions, Brian Bartlett draws our attention to Wordsworth's deliberate employment of the song imagery. For example, in the 1805 version, some fair enchanting image in my mind rose up, full formed like Venus from the sea, is changed to some lovely image in the song rose up, full formed like Venus rising from the sea in the later edition. Need I dread from thee harsh judgments if I am so loath to quit? Is revised to need I dread from thee harsh judgments if the song be loath to quit. I mean to speak of that interminable building becomes the song would speak of that interminable building. And I mean to speak of that delightful time of growing youth is rewritten as the song might dwell on that delightful time of growing youth. Bartlett's meticulous tracing of Wordsworth's use of musical metaphor, however, has not led to a larger critical claim on the suggestive interconnection of the mind, the poet, and the song in Wordsworth's compositional process by reference to the poetic implications and purposes of his musical figurations. In adopting the notion of music as a representation of his poetry, Wordsworth reflects in his poetic song an essential unity of his disparate sources of inspiration. Having established his poetry as a piece of musical composition, Wordsworth illuminates the harmonizing mechanism involved in the process of such creation. To explicate the ultimate goal of his poetic song, Wordsworth draws an analogy between the development of a poet's mind and the formation of musical harmony. Wordsworth exhibits himself as a poet-composer who transforms discord into harmony by presenting the intricate craftsmanship of the poet's mind through the orderly and systematic organization of music. With a deliberate purpose to construct and implement order, the mind accommodates and frames conflicting elements into a structured creation through the poet's greatest game of musicianship. The poet's mind is framed even like the breath and harmony of music. There is a dark, invisible workmanship that reconciles discordant elements and makes them move in one society. Wordsworth makes an explicit link here between the integrative properties of the mind and the harmony of music, where the formation of the poet's mind reflects the relationship between the breath required for sound projection and its projected harmony. Wordsworth appropriates the coalescing quality of music to represent his poem's internal structural response to external and organized matters. The poet's individual occurrences and encounters with nature are celebrated, although each respective element creates unintelligible discord on its own. These discordant elements would be unified under the harmony of one song through a dark and invisible force. This reconciling force, Wordsworth later elaborates, does not uphold uniformity, but retains the contrastive characteristics of individual modes of being, such that one sees the parts as parts, but with a feeling of the whole. The unifying impact of such invisible force resembles the reorganizing and regulating function of the imagination, the chemical faculty by which elements of the most different nature and distant origin are blended together into one harmonious and homogeneous whole. Retaining the feeling of the whole without dispelling the individual parts of which it is composed, the poetic faculty that assembles and houses external inspirations with inner feelings and emotions creates not only sound, but more importantly, harmony. Wordsworth projects his ideal state of poetic unity by accounting for the foundation of this dark and invisible ordering and reshaping power of the mind. Known as the first poetic spirit of our human life, the mind of the infant babe is prompt and watchful, eager to combine in one appearance all the elements and parts of the same object, else detached and loath to coalesce. The infant's mind, rather than being overpowered or subordinated to nature, works mutually with the external world and becomes even as an agent of the one great mind, creates, creator, and receiver both. The infantile mind as the manifestation of one greater mind that both creates and receives, combines the detached and separated external elements received and beheld by the senses. The infant's mind, which knows no separation with the external world, provides a paradigm for Wordsworth's imaginative creation, as it exemplifies the primal relatedness between the mind and nature. The word infant, etymologically meaning not able to speak, further suggests this idea of imaginative unity as a function of humans' pre-verbal feelings and our innate preconscious connection with nature. Coalescing differing feelings, impressions, and objects to recreate the active universe within itself, the mind of the infant in sum represents the wholeness of the self and the soul achieved through the unifying power of human passion. The mind that is connected with nature as part of his creation shares the same features with nature. This primal unity between nature and the poet, typically expressed in one of Wordsworth's earliest memories. He describes the blending of his nurse's song with the voice of Darwin in his preconscious state of infancy. Was it for this that one, the fairest of all rivers, loved to blend his murmurs with my nurse's song? And from his water shades and rocky falls, and from his falls and shallows sent a voice that flowed along my dreams. Originally placed at the opening of the 1799 version of the Prelude, this passage poignantly acknowledges the poet's sensitivity to the power of the musical landscape. Wordsworth directly addresses the Darwin that since birth integrates serenely with his infant nursery rhymes in order to connect his life with his native river. His relationship with nature is reciprocal, as not only the sound of the flowing river resembles his nurse's song, but the song resonates with the river's sound. Ultimately, Jason Snart rightly writes, by invoking his own poetry as song, Wordsworth is suggesting that if his poetry is ordered or composed by the force of harmony that operates in music, nature, and mind, it will be able to communicate to the reader, just as nature itself has communicated so much to Wordsworth. Murmurs of the river originally do not have a meaning in their own right, but by blending the ceaseless music of nature with Wordsworth's nurse's song, the river projects a voice that would later have its inspirational effect on the poet. The voice leads Wordsworth to compose his thoughts and knowledge like the harmonious music that nature creates, such that he could maintain his composure amid the fretful dwellings of mankind. Through establishing a mutual interaction between his poetic song and the steady cadence of the river, Wordsworth confirms nature as a form of agency that permits the transfer of the harmonious impulse inherent in music through the poet to readers and the whole of humanity. In connection with the unifying implication of water, Bartlett notes how Wordsworth's initial statement that the two blended suggests that whatever applies to one might apply to the other. So the primacy of either voice is hard to establish, which only affirms the harmony and sense of oneness in the experience. The description of the voice is suggestive of something that is sent out at the onset from nature, entering into his dreams, rather than something that originates in the mind of the poet. Wordsworth's immersion of the inspiring voice of nature thus becomes a mode of self-expression, where the objective reflection of the external world blends musically with the poet's corresponding subjective response to his creative process. By putting forward an ideal state of correspondence between the mind and nature in the beginning of his autobiographical poem, Wordsworth creates the aim of his poetry with the nature of music to confirm his poetry writing as a harmonizing act. As musical harmony is constructed and employed by Wordsworth as a framework for his mind and his imaginative process, we shall evaluate whether this perfect infantile harmony is ever achieved by his poetic experiences. Wordsworth's musical representations of the mind, which denotes a transformation of breath into harmony, exemplify the various powers requisite for composition laid out in preface to poems. Referring to one of the earliest processes of nature in the development of this faculty, Wordsworth is guided by one of his own primary consciousness that cooperates with external accidents to plant for immortality images of sound and sight in the celestial soil of the imagination. Before exalting its ability to modify, to create, and to associate, the mind would first deploy a perceptive power only in submission to necessity and never for a continuance of time, whereas exercise supposes all the higher qualities of the mind to be passive and in a state of subjection to external objects. The compositional process detailed in the preface facilitates an understanding of how the infant sensibility progresses and attempts to reconcile with the external world in Wordsworth's developed and conscious mind. It recognizes the interaction between the poet and nature as pivotal to the creative process and identifies an active spiritual force in nature that could be utilized by the mind as poetic inspiration. Wordsworth's use of musical metaphors reveals the mind's capacity to submit to such creative character in the atmosphere, its ability to translate the aesthetic and animated breath of nature into poetic harmony. Commonly employed as a romantic analogue of the poetic mind, the Aeolian harp is a dynamic conception of the mind that involves both the suppression and operation of the will. The Aeolian harp is a figurative mediator that blends the Orphean qualities of a stringed instrument with the Dionysian properties of a wind instrument. Tracing from the tuning to the sounding of the Aeolian harp, John Hollander notes that the harp comprises within itself the blending of instrumental sound and outdoor noises of wind, which was becoming in late 18th century England the imagination's authentic music. Understanding the poetic mind as both receptive and creative, Wordsworth transformed the Aeolian musical instrument into a figure of his own mind. As is pertinently pointed out by Abrams, Athanasius Kircher, the scientist who constructed the first known Aeolian harp in 1650, also perfected the camera obscura in 1646. Kircher's involvement in the making of both instruments points to the context within which the Aeolian instrument emerges as a figure of the mind. John Locke's representation of the camera obscura in 1689 reads the senses as windows that allow light to enter into the dark room of the human body, where the light projects an image of the external scene on a screen or wall that signifies the mind. Locke's theory of representative perception and knowledge of the object, grounded in Plato's and Aristotle's metaphors for the passive nature of sense perception, views the mind in perception of primary qualities such as shapes and sizes as a passive receiver. The mind for Locke is a tabula rasa in which external sensations write or paint themselves. It involves a direct reflection of the external object. The auditory, however, engages with the secondary sense qualities, meaning that sounds are ideas in the mind that depend on the perceiver without likeness of something existing. The change in the conception of the mind in perception from a reflection of the physical object, the camera obscura, to the creation of sound, that is the Aeolian harp, in accordance with the literary shift from mimesis to expression in the late 18th century, provides new considerations to the structure of the mind. The Aeolian harp retains the representation of the external that the camera obscura achieves, but also confers a productive element on its outcome. The sound-making process of the harp displays an orderly cooperation between the spontaneous wind movement and the constructed mechanism of the strings. The poet's mind, like the Aeolian harp, symbolically unifies inward and outward forms of impressions. Acknowledging the involvement of external energies and the actualization of natural aesthetics in his own creative processes, Wordsworth reimagines the seashell as an other representation and reflection of the poetic mind. The seashell, with a similar mediating role as the Aeolian line, reverberates with the wind movement through the intricate labyrinth of his mathematic spiral and symmetrical ratio that Wordsworth addresses in On the Power of Sound. The seashell, as an organic material that belongs to nature, figures natural openness and creativity. As an embodiment of both the organic and the mechanical, The shell celebrates its plasticity or adaptiveness by constantly adjusting and readjusting to changing external circumstances in its process of acoustic articulation. The shell is imagined to capture and transpose the inherent music of nature exclusively for the human ear. The romanticized seashell, as Hollander notes, is another figure of the line as well as a kind of reciprocal ear. Hollander addresses the confusion between Hermes' corded tortoise shell and Triton's trumpeting spiral shell. Whereas the former was the natural objects converted to a harp or lyre for cultural use by divine power, the latter, as a remaking of a human's inner ear, is a place of echo and reverberation, sounding and resounding, a strict passage in a hollow space where music is made and heard. To reconstruct musica mundana by qualifying human music through the accompanying testimonial of natural sound, Hollander corrects the common errors that register the sound of the seashell as the roaring ocean, or as the amplified coursing of one's own blood in the capillaries of his ear. Although the symbolic connotation of the latter interpretation reauthenticates the imagined exterior sea sound in the inner perception of an equivalent blood tide, Hollander instead points to the poetic significance of a shell-ear comparison, which involves the total demythologizing of the simple phenomenon of amplified background noise. Different from the Aeolian imagery, the spiral shell, as the replicate of the human's inner ear, accentuates the process of attention, of being listened to, rather than simply being an instrument associating with the audible. The focus, therefore, is transferred from the sound itself to the act of listening, as well as the activity of the ear or the auditory sense. In the 1800 preface to Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth considers man and nature as essentially adapted to each other, and the mind of man as naturally the mirror of the fairest and most interesting properties of nature. The poet's mind replicates not the products of nature, but rather nature's creative properties and transformative powers. To adopt Wordsworth's visual analogy on the dimension of sound, the interaction between human and nature resembles the echoing mechanism of a sounding shell. Such a mechanism exemplifies a harmonization between external forces and human thoughts, and ultimately exhibits metaphorically the mind's dialogue with its own silent workings. The union between the external forces and internal mechanism as a result renders the shell an idealized form of the poetic mind, as it brings together human and natural efforts to decipher meanings and compose poetry. The figures of the Aeolian harp and the seashell both demonstrates the mind's dependence on natural forces prior to its productive imagination that creates the harmony of music. As both the harp and the shell requires an initial breeze for sound making, Wordsworth implies that the preliminary stage of his writing process also depends on natural external initiatives before any subsequent imaginative development takes place. The poet's visionary experiences, therefore, most often begin with an account of his ordinary perception of the world, where nature is there to foster a poetic initiative. Using these musical figures to signify the functioning of his poetic mind, Wordsworth shows that the first stage of his compositional process entails the mind's wise passiveness and its surrender to surrounding stimulations and inspiration. Categorizing himself as obedient as a lute that waits upon the touches of the wind, Wordsworth prepares his mind for the consummation and infiltration by natural poetic inspirations. The metrical imitation of the initial apostrophic O first indicates a possible transfer of inspiration from poetic breath to music of the verse, establishing itself as in part a trochaic stress and in part a rest in iambic pentameter. The word raises readers' awareness of the breathing pattern during the rhythmic articulation of the lines to cultivate a sense of self-consciousness and reflexivity. This potential intersection among poetic elements is confirmed by Wordsworth's own experience. As he arrives at Grasmere after spending his previous years in London, Wordsworth, in the opening lines of the prelude, acknowledges an outer breeze or respiratory air that not only refreshes him physically, but in a biblical allusion to the book of 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 23, it also nourishes him spiritually. For I methought, while the sweet breath of heaven was blowing on my body, felt within a corresponding mild creative breeze, a vital breeze which travelled gently on over things which it had made, and it's become a tempest, a redundant energy vexing its own creation. Sharing the same root spiritus, the corresponding mild creative breeze revived by the sweet breath of heaven is Wordsworth's own poetic inspiration. The spiritual reception of the pure and unobstructed breezes and the breath of paradise reminds Wordsworth of a music and a voice harmonious as his own, which resonates with the poet's soul and is to be felt within the heart. Abrams points out that the recurrent wind is a leitmotif representing the chief theme of continuity and interchange between outer motions and the interior life and powers, which provides the poem with a principle of organization beyond chronology. There's a harmonious transfer of energy from an outer source to an inner realization, where the rising wind, usually linked with the outer transition from winter to spring, is correlated with a complex subjective process, the return to a sense of community after isolation, an outburst of creative power following a period of imaginative sterility. I breathe again, in Wordsworth's own words, as trances of thought and mountings of the mind come fast upon me. It is shaken off, as by a miraculous gift 'tis shaken off, that burden of my own unnatural self. The breeze as a symbol of an external inspiration that reverberates with Wordsworth's inner spirit, acts as an elementary energy that awakens and reassures him of all the vital elements necessary for a poet's creative imagination. These include confidence in his mastery and aspirations, the capacity to experience passions in life, and the knowledge to reflect upon and articulate his emotions. In response to what Wordsworth's lyricism fundamentally upholds, the vital breeze brings together the holy life of music and of verse, achieving the quality of the lyric through the musicality of language and poetry. The movement of refracted air as a vital activator for both the harp and the shell to produce sound implies the presence of active musical elements stored in the breath of the atmosphere, which, when interacting with the instruments, release themselves as melodies. Wordsworth, through The Wanderer, proposes an active principle that pervades all aspects of the world, aligning his observation with the role of nature that fails not to provide impulse and utterance for humanity. This active aspect of nature that channels musicality to the poet through the perceptive mind resonates with William Jones's treatise on music, harmony, and air. To examine the interaction between breath and harmony, Jones first dismisses the conception that musical air is the thing too volatile for critical analysis, aiming to reconcile air with reason, where air is the production of the fancy or imagination, Jones presents an analogy between the function of musical air and poetic structure. As poetry and music are nearly allied, poetic properties such as matter, style, meter, subject, syntax, and the figures of rhetoric are applicable to the understanding of musical air. In other words, it is possible to understand musical air as a poetic structure. This association of the two forms of art is first introduced in Jones's earlier work, Physiological Disquisition, where he unites musical and linguistic properties through his concept of air. According to Jones, air is always musical and dynamic in nature. The wave motion of air particles undulates to various frequency to generate sound. In support of his idea of the musicality of air, Jones uses the mechanism of the optical prism as an analogy. First, I lay it down that music is in air as colors are in light, that as colors are produced by inflections and refractions of the rays of light, so musical sounds are produced by similar refractions of the air. There is no reason to suppose that air is homogeneous in its part any more than light. If air consists of heterogeneous parts, they will be differently refrangible according to their magnitudes and excite different sounds as they are accommodated to different vibrations and capable of different velocities as the parts of light which are differently refrangible give different colors. Resembling the mechanism of a prism, the harp and the shell both create sound by splitting air into different magnitudes, vibrations, and velocities. They create an element of sound that is not conditioned by the physical construction or the tuning of the instrument, but by the movement of refracted air. Although atmospheric air may seem silent, it is always musical. The unheard melodies of the air are actualized when air particles pass through the strings of the harp or the cochlea of the shell. Jones's study reveals a new species of sound that grants an intrinsic musicality or harmony to the air, conferring an audible and aesthetic quality on nature and the natural phenomenon. Jones's study of musical air is significant to the romantic conception of the poet's mind and the imagination. His idea of air as inherently musical confirms the external nature as an active and constructive source of inspiration. The intersection of sound and light, as well as the interplay between air and the imagination, are most famously illuminated in a passage Coleridge had added in 1817 to the poem he renamed The Aeolian Harp in Sibylline Leaves. Oh, the one life within us and abroad, which meets all motion and becomes its soul, a light in sound and a sound like power in light, rhythm in all thought and joins everywhere. Methinks it should have been impossible not to love all things in a world so filled, where the breeze warbles and the mute still air its music slumbering on her instrument. Jones's idea of the light sound analogy is manifested here as the sound like power in light or the light in sound. This interplay between the visual and the auditory illuminates both the background of inventing the Aeolian harp, as well as Jones's theory of refracted air. Possibly derived from his theory of divine interchange or creative communion between the perceiving subject and the perceived object, Coleridge employs the harp to illustrate the productive power in nature and the creative power in humans. The mute still air stores an unsounded music that, with the aid of the caressing breeze, is made audible by the Aeolian harp as long sequentious notes of lovely melodies to bring joins everywhere. The organic harps are instruments that not only reveal the silent music in the breeze, but also actualize the music of poetry as accentuated by the articulation of the end rhymes, where and air. Coleridge's vitalistic theory of the imagination requires the divine numer of the universe to breathe inspiration to the poet to uphold a unity between the poet and the world. Therefore, the intellectual breeze that breathes through the harp in the first version becomes one that sweeps over them with the fact of turning the breath of God into an actual wind in the published edition in 1796. Speaking to his observation that the sense of musical delight is a gift of the imagination, in Biographia Literarum, the harmonizing effect of the harp reifies Coleridge's philosophical interaction with the god of wind as an exemplar of both poetic inspiration and greater love. Although Coleridge later dispels the analogy between the harp and the mind, his intellectual breeze, plastic and fast, is nonetheless reimagined by Wordsworth as a shaping spirit and forming hand. Acting as a local spirit that defies general tendency, the plastic power is described as at war with nature. Humbled by external things, the isemplastic power of the soul develops a creative sensibility and grows subservient to the inherent quality of the landscape. This receptive condition of the soul sustains until an auxiliary light came from his mind. The characteristic shift of creative energies, aided by the turn and movement of the verse, reinforces the influences of nature. Referring to the passage, James Heffernan writes, "These lines reveal the special function of creative sensibility. It enables the imagination to shape and modify in perfect harmony with impulses received. It does not twist, manipulate, or distort. It simply intensifies. The intensifying of inspiration is complemented by the light sound lines that once again come into play. The gentle breezes alongside the auxiliary sun rays are refracted as a midnight storm vexes the poet's imagination." In Wordsworth's process of writing, as Jeffrey Hartman phrases it, nature drew him out, released life in him, and gradually made it conscious. Hartman recognizes the role of the unconscious in Wordsworth's theory of the imagination, where this idea of unconsciousness reveals the inadequacy of the poet's mind and confirms the necessity for a general subservience to nature. One crucial difference of Wordsworth's imagination from Coleridge's primary imagination, the essential creative faculty of the perception, is its durability. Throughout the development of the prelude, Wordsworth presents the various challenges that test the durability of such given capacity. In the face of inevitable and compromising vexations and trials, the question to tackle now would be, in what ways and to what extent can the perfect harmony of infantile sensibility be realized and sustained through the growth of the poet's mind by his more than usual imaginative capability and durability? Relying on natural forces as the stimulus, Wordsworth is aware that his creative process is not constantly under the complete control of his own will, and so consequently would not always be perfect and pleasant. The interaction between the mind and nature does not immediately necessitate the successful production of poetic creativity, as his initial subservience is susceptible to unknown and unpredictable forces. Wordsworth does not fail to recognize a darker aspect to his inspirational breeze, where his poetic dependence on its external initiative is prone to the redundant, disruptive, and unsettling forces of the storm. manifesting both the constructive and destructive effects of music in his poetry. Wordsworth compares nature to some vivid and exciting musical accompaniment. Through the use of an extremely rapid and impressive blank verse, Wordsworth appreciates that sounds created by natural surroundings could be chaotic and confusing at times. While the haunting notes from the earth scatter around without a definite form or meaning, the constructive energy of music, on the contrary, waits upon your skillful touch, sounds which the wandering shepherd from these heights hears and forgets his purpose. For the Aeolian harp, it has the capacity to speak a truth that the poet fits to his pensive lyre, and with the highest, holiest raptures of the line and wisdom married to immortal verse. Yet it is also possible that, despite the Aeolian visitations, the harp was soon defrauded, and the banded host of harmony dispersed in straggling sounds, and lastly, utter silence. The fine music of the harp is depicted as an army at the brink of being disbanded, where its harmony disperses into straggling sounds. The musical unity of the harp breaks down into utter silence, followed by a lengthened and magnified textual pause that signifies the poet's imaginative failure. Later, Wordsworth's disillusionment with the revolution is accompanied by the wild blast of music from the same instrument, where the sound of the prophetic harps in every grove were ringing, war shall cease, did ye not hear that conquest is abjured? The harp as a romantic poetization of the mind epitomizes a tension between its vulnerability to the unruly and unsettling elements of a storm and its embodiment of a divine citation through which the wind blows its prophecy. The seashell, in similar fashion, not only symbolize the unity between reasoning and the imagination, but also captures the apocalyptic undertone of the harp. Its most significant appearance occurs in Wordsworth's account of Eric Dream in Book 5 of the Prelude. The poet's friend enters into a dreamlike trance and hears a reproduction of the shell's hollow vibrations. The stranger said, my friend continuing, stretched forth the shell towards me, with command that I should hold it to my ear. I did so, and heard that instant in an unknown tongue, which yet I understood, articulate sounds, a loud prophetic blast of harmony, an ode and passion uttered, which foretold destruction to the children of the earth by deluge now at hand. Through its harmonizing interaction, the shell articulates an ode that brings a joy, a consolation, and a hope to humanity with the promise of redemption. Articulating the prophetic language of the ode in an unknown tongue, the shell possesses the beauty and truth of human that could overcome the artificiality of language and reconstruct fable, bring Wordsworth back to the pre-linguistic and pre-conscious state of infantile sensibility. The prelude passage is reworked into a longer version in Excursion, where the shell's ever-enduring power is transfers peace, joy, and faith from the child's auditory sense to his soul, from the shell's natural origin in the native sea to his heart. The solitary who attends to the sonorous cadences of the universe describes and experiences an experience of hearing the enduring language of nature's heavenly impulses through the seashell. The image of an infant is used in conjunction with the shell to express how a child who engages with nature in perfect harmony receives nature's authentic tidings eternally. Nonetheless, Wordsworth achieves a strange knowingness and self-deception that unsettles the mysterious murmurings heard from the shell. The sound heard from the shell is merely a close resemblance, but not the real sound of the ocean. The sounding of the shell, moreover, seen from the prelude version, does not lack a sense of apocalypse. Representing a call for action in ancient mythology, the shell's loud prophetic blast of harmony proclaims the impending end of the world, foretelling destruction and heralding a deluge that will endanger civilization. On the whole, Wordsworth's process of composition involves both the making of sense and a sense of making. It requires a formation of perceptive sensibility and the imagination, subsequent ordering and reordering of the poet's experience. Throughout his life, Wordsworth sought the effort and capacity to overcome the dissonant sounds and incorporate them as part of his harmonizing act, in a bid to redeem the perfect infantile relationship with nature through the workings of his imagination. Through examining the mind's perceptive and creative interactions with nature in his prose and poems, as well as demonstrating them in his processes of poetry writing, Wordsworth performs his idea of poetic harmony central to his theory of the imagination through his meticulous use of musical metaphors and imagery. To sum up and to open my lecture for further thoughts, I would like to conclude with my own definition of Wordsworth's poetics of harmony. Wordsworthian harmony is a constructive rather than reductive form of imaginative unity. His idea of harmony is more than the sum of different parts, not the reduction of many to one, but the construction of a whole from the many. In other words, Wordsworth's harmony is about unity, not uniformity. The idea of harmony is not just reconciliation, but involves the awareness of retaining individual characteristics in order to allow a reversal in the unifying process, such that individuality and unity is a two-way relationship. His poetry does not create harmony by reducing and dissipating dissonance and noise, but by sounding and sustaining an infinite range of possibilities and varieties. His purpose of creating productive and pleasurable attention and variations in his meditative and imaginative processes encourages an interaction of diverse characters and a coexistence of individual occurrences and expressiveness within a dynamic wholeness and interconnectedness. Whereas this harmony achieves a comprehensive and complex balance between opposite and discordant elements under one organized and collective whole, such that, as he writes of nature, nothing is defined into an absolute independent singleness. As Wordsworth's understanding of harmony does not entail a perfect or absolute unity, but a union of irresolvable impulses, the ultimate aim of his poetry is to reveal and make sense rather than to arrive at a resolution. The unifying power of the imagination and the poetic mind does not involve a reconciliation of contrary elements into a greater, higher order. It does not subdue any sense of loss, nor can it cancel out the despairing voice of chaos. In the face of the magnitude of unresolvable conditions, Wordsworth expresses in his poetry a recognition of human limitations and a response to the insufficiency of humanity. Wordsworth's poetry is about learning to live with distress and anxiety without losing faith in nature and accepting the existence of the unknown and the unexplainable in this world by cultivating hope in a possible harmony. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yimon. Thanks so much for that talk. We have about half an hour for questions, I think. I was particularly taken, Yimon, with what you were saying towards the end there in your excellent final definition of Wordsworth's harmony. I just noted down some phrases that you were using about unity, not uniformity, irresolvable impulses held together.
Hi,
Oh,
Tom. I don't think I can hear you. Maybe
am I to myself again?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yeah.
You hear me now? Okay, great. Thanks for telling me, Yimon. It happened last time as well. When I tried to give my vote of thanks, but so I'll start again. Thanks so much, Yimon. It was a fantastic talk, and I was just noting down at the end some of the things you were saying in your concluding definition of Wordsworth's musical harmony. You had phrases about unity, not uniformity, irresolvable impulses held together, and you talked about learning to live with distress. So, useful words, I think, words of counsel and of anti-fragility, I suppose, would be one way of kind of framing what you're talking about. I wonder if as a question, if I could draw out if I could link that back to the thing you quoted from James Heffernan, where you talk about the lines in book 2, and Heffernan says, you quote him saying that Wordsworth here is showing the special function of creative sensibility, not to twist or distort, but simply to intensify. And I wonder if Heffernan is in some way missing some of the rebelliousness or the deviousness that, as Wordsworth puts it himself in his language there. He talks about being his plastic power being at times rebellious, acting in a devious mood. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about some of the sort of disruptiveness or the sense possibly of competition sometimes in Wordsworth's poetry between words and music. And I guess I'm thinking of sister art type competition here. Wordsworth was famously hostile to visual arts in some ways, or at least he's been shown to be that way. And I guess I'm thinking also of passages like book 5, where he talks about the visionary power and the motion of the winds embodied in the mystery of words, where words seem to be different from music, perhaps.
Hi, I'm back.
I was asking a relatively long question, Yimon. Did any of it come through? I'm not sure if it's the internet maybe isn't working that well at both ends of the call today. Yimon, are you there? Can you hear me? I'll stop my own video bandwidth.
Okay, good. So I can see that there is a question in the chat. Would you like me to read it out, or Tom? Can you?
Yeah, I'll read it. Yimon,
summarize the question? Yeah.
Did any of my question come through, Yimon? Did you?
I don't think so. No. No.
All right.
Sorry.
Well,
no.
It might be on the recording anyway, but maybe that's not such a bad thing. It was a long question, but maybe just to invite you to talk more about some of the disruption, the disturbance that you were talking about at the end of your talk. But let's go to the question that you mentioned is in the chat from Yuja. So Yuja's question is in relation to your paper on Tintin Abbey. according to which musicality in Tintin Abbey is manifested by connecting poetry with rhythm and sound. And the question, I think so, summarize the question, is on Wordsworth's contemporary Keats, Wordsworth being widely recognized as the most effective contemporary for Keats. Are Keats's odes Wordsworthian, and are they Wordsworthian perhaps in their sense of music? If I can try to summarize the question that way, and maybe reducing the complexity of the question a little bit, but are Keats's odes Wordsworthian in the sense of Wordsworthian music, as you've been defining it, Yimon?
Right, it's interesting that you point out a number of odes. I do think so, yeah, they do speak to one another, particularly how music or harmony or even melodies are used in Keats's ode to Grecian, and it's a form of a way of how distant melodies are sweeter. So that's what Wordsworth have written about, how distance had made melodies or harmonies sweeter in a way in retrospect. So I do think they speak or they relate to each other in a way how music or harmony works in retrospect in speakers' memories, and how music, it's an agency that unifies different moments of the poet's life, the past, present, and future. And it's an agency to unify poet's mind in a way. Yes, so I guess that's all I have in mind for Keats. And it's interesting for me to compare, if we are to compare Keats and Wordsworth, particularly since Wordsworth was not musically trained, but so much has written about Keats in terms of a comparison between actual music and poetry, so comparison between two forms of art rather than reading into a more imaginative or philosophical understanding of music as a philosophical shaping presence in Keats's work. So if I'm not wrong, there's a book by John Minahan, I think that's how you pronounce his name. It's on Keats's music and the Romantic poet, and he writes about this idea of how Keats's interest and proficiency in music sort of give a historical credence to the investigation of comparative reading of music and poetry in Keats's works.
Any other and more questions for Yimon? A question from Henry in the chat. Thank you, Yimon. I love your discussion of the harp and the shell, very romantic depictions of music. My question is, are there any perhaps more surprising kinds of music in Wordsworth's poetry? Surprising.
Thank you for the question. I suppose surprising, yes, it's interesting. And perhaps that also goes back to Tom's question on strangeness and the sense of disorientation or unfamiliarity, this idea of surprise in Wordsworthian harmony. So in one of the chapters in my book, I've looked at the role of all these unforeseen impulses or deviation, the unsettling and mysterious aspects of Wordsworth's auditory imagination. And I suppose these would constitute what you would call a more surprising understanding of Wordsworth's use of music. So I looked at his treatment of metrical dislocation and also various sorts of representations of auditory displacement and distorted sensory perception through the psychological theories of musical expectations are how a moment it's constituted as a surprise is based on a past expectation of a future, let's say, a future sensory impression. So this unexpected moment of surprise generates versions, moments of sublime breakthrough in Wordsworth's poetry, or in these sudden perceptual experiences that we could see, let's say, not only in Wordsworth's experience of nature and music of nature, but also in his representation of the city, his urban experiences. So yes, I've definitely looked at the blind beggar passage in relation to his representation of the city and how he sort of comes into terms and negotiates with all these unfamiliar or surprising encounter with urban movements and noises.
Adam has a question.
Hi, can you hear me? Am I coming through the mic?
Yes, Adam. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Hi, Yimon. Thanks for your talk.
Hi.
Yeah, nice to see you. The question I had is about if you could talk more about your concept of nature, because it seems like a really important concept for your work. And a lot of the statements you made were about sort of like the mind and nature becoming reciprocal sort of forces in the creation of poetry. So it becomes a big sort of other half of what's going on. And in recent sort of ecological writings, as you probably know, there's been sort of like some skepticism about nature as a concept. And some writers like Timothy Morton have even said, like, there is no such thing as nature. You need to develop ecology without nature, that kind of thing, because it's just a kind of invented concept. And I've always wondered how I felt about that. I was never sure, because I personally like the concept. And so I was just wondering if you can you give kind of a definition of nature from a Wordsworthian perspective, how we would think about it, and how we would think about it maybe from a philosophical point of view as being something that can help to generate these kinds of creative responses and participations.
Thank you, Adam. Very interesting question. Yeah, so nature these days is a very fluid term. I suppose that inspirations that comes from beyond the mind, beyond the internal faculties of the poet. It's something that's uncontrollable. It's something that's susceptible to all sorts of impressions, I suppose. Well, nature is more of, the external environment for what I have in mind. But from your question, I suppose you are referring to something that's outside of the poet's mind. That's not something that's fixed. That's not something that the poet can control, but a more sort of just interesting to think about it in terms of whether the divine humor of the universe, as I mentioned in the talk, has something, it's something that's related to nature specifically, or it's something more. So that's a very Wordsworthian topic to think. That's also what the poet himself had struggled with as he writes about this divine humor, that this idea of breath from the outside, of something that's external to him, how he comes about and facing and negotiating with these external circumstances, these external impressions, and how he himself sort of responds to these uncontrollable or even at times disruptive inspiration. So yes, I guess I don't have a definitive answer to your question, but this is my general thoughts of what nature could be about, or could be for Wordsworth. Yeah.
Thank you. I see. I have a short follow-up question, if that's okay, because I noticed too at the end you're trying to define Wordsworth nature in a way that it can accompany our sort of discomfort and our pratfalls in life, that kind of thing, which is important. And I was going to ask, I guess, because I think the opponents of nature as a concept are usually materialist. So do you think that there's and this is kind of a hard question, do you think that there's a transcendent aspect of nature? Like, is there more to nature than simply the world around us? Does it have an ideal aspect?
Right. Yeah, that's a difficult question to tackle, but I guess the short answer would be yes, for Wordsworth definitely incorporate some form of transcendental qualities in nature, but it's more of a spiritual response to nature rather than anything that's religious in a way. Let's say in his Immortality Odes, it's of his own understanding of the universe, or whatever you were talking about, the more transcendental qualities of the sound of nature, rather than a more religious or Christian view of transcendentalism.
Thank you.
Thanks, Yimon, and thanks Adam for not asking easy questions. It's a challenging question. Listening to the question and Yimon's answer, I was reminded of Coleridge has a passage in Friend.
Is there a hand?
There is. I'm coming to Daniel in a second. Coleridge has a passage in The Friend where he talks about the two.
That was absolutely fascinating, not least because I'm in my last year of PhD where I'm focusing on William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So this is really, really informative. Thank you so much. My question was about whether you've, I noticed you were looking at mainly, the poems that I'm mainly not looking at. So the Prelude and the Excursion. And I've been focusing more on poems like Peter Bell, Goody Blake and Harry Gill, The Idiot Boy. And what I've been noticing is that there's a lot of echoes of children's literature, sort of the sing-song kind of idea, nursery rhyme. There's lots of repetition and lots of music in that kind of sense, like a kind of a musical galloping forward in some of his poetry. And I just wondered if you'd found any similar things or anything that, if you had, how that might fit within your larger argument.
And it's more, do you mean the rhythm of the poem? It's more of a sing-song, nursery rhyme kind of, or are you talking about the subject or subject matter, or in what aspect are you thinking? Yeah,
less the subject matter, although in Peter Bell, I would still argue that there's, the flight of fancy in the prologue is incredibly nursery-like in its subject matter. But yeah, in particular, the not just the lexis, but actually the repetitional structures as well, lots of repetition. I wondered just what you'd made of that, if you'd noticed it.
Right, so yes, so in his ballads there are most definitely repetition of sort, and I've also made an argument in one of the chapters on Tintin Abbey, how his use of the word burden adds a musical implication of the word burden, meaning some sort of a chorus, but it's less, I guess, when Wordsworth use the term burden, we can see this double connotation of the word and how he sort of relates to the musical idea of repetition, but less in a more, it's not so much that's, so I guess for nursery rhymes or music, let's say, in in general, the repetition of the chorus is more structured, so you can expect a certain line to come at a certain time or point in the lyrics. But for Wordsworth's use of repetition, it's less predictable in a way, and I find it quite interesting to see how these unpredictable, unexpected qualities work in his poems. So I guess that's what deviates from a general reading of nursery rhymes when we come across repetition. It's how Wordsworth uses all these formal structures and repetition as the way to set up a reader's expectation and then to almost sort of dispel it. And his poems are not merely ballads, but they are lyrical ballads. So they are lyrical in a sense that they do not conform to a specific structure of the ballad, of a predictable sort of repetition, but to add some elements of lyricism to it by sort of juxtaposing our conventional understanding of the ballad form with a more sort of lyrical way in terms of meter, in terms of how he deals with rhythm and repetition in a way to create a very sort of paradoxical, at times a conflicting reading of a very simple tale of let's say, of Peter Bell.
Great, thank you.
I think there's another.
There's
So
one more.
there's another question in the chat. Yes.
I'm not sure if my audio is working again, but yeah, Henry has a follow-up question about are there more traditional instruments that Wordsworth draws on or alludes to? Typical orchestral instruments? Is it all wind harps and shells? So is it all sort of improvised orchestra, or is it are there kind of traditional orchestral instruments in Wordsworth?
I would say for instruments, I can't seem to think of any other instruments, but I guess vocal sort of sounds work really well with Wordsworth's poetry as well. For example, bird songs, the song singing, like for example, in the Solitary Reaper song of a singing voice can be viewed as an instrument, I suppose. And in To the Cuckoo, so there's the wandering voice of the cuckoo's singing sound or call. So that would be what I would say as more traditional instrument in a way. It's not a musical instrument, but there's a more vocal aspect to his understanding of traditional music and how he also uses these vocal elements as a way to challenge the idea of music, of silence in poetry. So yes, I guess what I have in mind would be the Reaper song, as well as the Cuckoo's Call, the bird songs, but not any other particular musical instruments in that sense.
Thanks very much, Yimon. Thanks for answering all the questions that we posed to you. I think we've come to the end of our time. So can I just invite everyone to thank Yimon again, show our appreciation for her fantastic talk. Round of applause for Yimon.
Thank you very much for coming, and thanks for all the questions.